He asked, "Are you sure it's mine?" when she told him she was pregnant. 2 years later, he saw the twins, and knew everything had changed. Alexander Reed was a man who had built his life on precision and power. Every corner of his world was orderly, from the gleaming marble floors of his penthouse to the empire he had constructed with his own ambition. He thrived on numbers, negotiations, and results, not feelings. He told himself that emotions were distractions, that vulnerability was weakness, that love was something people believed in because they needed comfort. But that was before Emma Walker entered his life, with her soft laughter and the kind of quiet strength that could disarm even the most guarded soul. She was everything he didn't understand and everything he secretly craved. Emma was light where he was shadow. She worked in the marketing department of his company, a small voice in a massive machine, and yet somehow, she had captured the attention of the man everyone feared to speak to. He noticed her one evening after hours, staying late to finish a presentation. Most employees cleared out the moment the clock hit 6, but she remained, sipping cheap coffee and tapping at her keyboard with determination. Something about her focus intrigued him. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, least of all him. She was simply doing her job with care. He admired that, even if he couldn't admit it to himself. What began as curiosity became something far more dangerous. He started finding reasons to pass through her department, to ask questions he already knew the answers to linger just long enough to hear her voice. She treated him like a person, not a legend or a paycheck, and that terrified him. Over the months that followed, their paths crossed more often. Dinners turned into long conversations turned into stolen moments, and before either of them realized it, they had fallen into something that neither of them could define. Alexander didn't know how to love gently. He loved like he did everything, intensely, completely, and with control. But with Emma, control was impossible. She laughed at his arrogance, challenged his certainty, and saw the man behind the reputation. For the first time, he felt seen. She spoke about dreams and futures, about simple happiness, about family. He had never thought about children before, never considered the softness of that kind of life, but when she talked about it, it didn't seem frightening. It seemed almost beautiful. But love is fragile when built on two different worlds. As their relationship deepened, whispers spread through his company. People talked, about the boss and the girl from marketing, about impropriety, about scandal. He hated it. It made him feel exposed, vulnerable, and angry. He didn't like being the subject of gossip. He didn't like the way others looked at her as if she were just another conquest. He began to pull back, coldly and abruptly, unable to handle how much power she suddenly had over his heart. Emma felt it. She tried to reach him, to remind him that love was not a liability, but he had already started to build walls again, shutting her out with the same precision he used in business. Then came the night that changed everything. She came to his office, her eyes bright with something between fear and hope, her hands trembling as she told him she was pregnant. The words hung in the air like thunder. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply stared at her, the woman he loved, the woman who had brought warmth into his calculated life, and he felt everything crumble inside him. Fear clawed at his chest. All his old beliefs roared back. This would destroy him, ruin his reputation, tie him down, make him weak. His emotions twisted into anger, and before he could stop himself, he said the words that would haunt him forever, "Are you sure it's mine?" The instant the words left his mouth, he wanted to take them back, but it was too late. He saw the light die in her eyes, the way her lips parted slightly as if she'd been physically struck. The silence that followed was unbearable. She didn't scream, didn't argue. She just stood there, heartbreak spreading across her face like cracks in glass. Then she turned and walked out of his office, her shoulders straight, her steps slow but certain. He didn't chase her. He told himself it was better that way, that he was doing the right thing for both of them. But the moment the door closed, the silence swallowed him whole. That night, he drank more than he had in years. He told himself she would call, that they would talk, that she would forgive him. But the call never came. Days turned into weeks, and when he finally went looking for her, she was gone. No resignation letter, no forwarding address, just absence. He tried to focus on work, but nothing filled the void. The world still called him brilliant, successful, untouchable, but behind closed doors, Alexander Reed felt like a ghost inside his own empire. Months passed, and the empire continued to grow, but he didn't. He threw himself into work, into meaningless distractions, into anything that would silence the memory of her voice. But every time he walked past the window of his office and saw the city stretching endlessly beneath him, he thought of her out there somewhere, carrying the child he had rejected. The guilt festered, quiet but relentless. He told himself that she was fine, that she didn't need him, that it was better this way, but he didn't believe a single word. At night, he dreamed of her laughter, her smile, and the way her eyes softened when she looked at him. And when he woke, the emptiness was worse. By the time 2 years had passed, Alexander had become the man the world expected him to be, cold, successful, efficient. But the man Emma had known was gone. What he didn't know was that the rain would soon bring him face to face with everything he had tried to bury. The past he had run from was still waiting for him, smaller, gentler, and more powerful than he could ever imagine, in the eyes of 2 little boys who would change his life forever. The rain had started early that morning, soft and steady at first, but by late afternoon the city was drowning beneath a gray curtain of water. Alexander Reed walked through the streets without an umbrella, his coat soaked, his hair curling slightly at the edges from the damp. He had left a meeting halfway through without explanation, unable to focus on anything the board members were saying. Their words blurred together like static. For months he had felt it, a gnawing sense of discontent, as though the life he'd built so carefully no longer fit. Success had lost its shine. The parties, the accolades, the sharp applause of a crowd that admired his power, it all sounded hollow. Even the apartment he lived in, perched high above the skyline, felt like a museum to a man he no longer recognized. Somewhere in the chaos of his empire, he had lost himself. But that day, though he didn't know it yet, he was about to find everything he thought was gone forever. He had no destination as he walked. The rain slicked the sidewalks, reflecting the neon glow of streetlights and car headlights. His phone buzzed in his pocket, messages from his assistant and business partners piling up, but he ignored them. He needed quiet. He needed to feel something real. The scent of rain mixed with the faint aroma of roasted coffee from a nearby cafe, and for a moment, he thought about going in to escape the downpour. That was when he saw her. At first, she was just another figure in the rain, a woman holding an umbrella, standing at a bus stop with 2 small children. But something about her posture made him look again. She was turned slightly to the side, her blonde hair darker from the rain, her blue eyes soft as she crouched down to fix a little boy's jacket. The boys were identical, small and delicate, their dark curly hair plastered to their foreheads, their eyes wide and curious as they watched the cars pass. Then one of them laughed, a bright, unrestrained sound that carried even through the noise of the rain, and Alexander felt his entire world stop. The sound was familiar, achingly so, and when he looked closer, it was as if lightning had struck him. It was her. It was Emma. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it. The rain blurred his vision, but when she stood and turned, he knew. Her face had changed slightly, thinner, more mature, a shadow of tiredness beneath her eyes, but it was her. The woman he had driven away, the woman who had haunted his every restless night. And then he saw the boys again, saw their deep brown eyes, saw the faint curl of their hair that matched his own when he was their age, and his breath left him in a single sharp exhale. The truth hit him so hard he stumbled. Those children were his. There was no question, no doubt, no need for words or tests. He could see himself in them as clearly as if he were looking into a mirror. He wanted to call out to her, to say her name, to run across the street and beg her to look at him. But something inside him froze. Fear rooted him to the spot, the same fear that had once made him push her away. What would he even say? That he was sorry? That he had been wrong? Those words felt meaningless compared to the weight of what he had done. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, and now she stood before him, not broken as he had imagined, but strong, independent, holding the lives he had turned his back on. He took a hesitant step forward, the rain drumming against his shoulders, his heart hammering so violently it hurt. Emma hadn't seen him yet. She was smiling down at one of the boys, who had dropped a small toy car into a puddle. She knelt to pick it up, her laugh soft and full of warmth, and for a moment, Alexander couldn't breathe. That sound, her laughter, had once filled his apartment, echoing in the spaces between late-night conversations and whispered promises. Hearing it again felt like being dragged back through time, to a life he had destroyed with his own arrogance. Then she looked up. Their eyes met through the rain. For a second, neither of them moved. The noise of the street vanished. The only sound left was the relentless rhythm of the rain, hitting the pavement like a heartbeat. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to something colder. Her lips parted slightly, and he could see the moment recognition hit her like a blade. The warmth disappeared from her eyes, replaced by something sharp, something that made his chest tighten painfully. Without a word, she grabbed the boy's hands, turning as if to leave. That small movement shattered his paralysis. "Emma," he called, his voice rough, desperate, cutting through the rain. She stopped but didn't turn. "Emma, please," he tried again, stepping into the street. Cars splashed water onto his legs, horns blaring as he crossed, but he didn't care. He reached the sidewalk just as she finally faced him. Up close, she looked even more breathtaking, and even more untouchable. The rain had darkened her hair to gold brown, droplets clinging to her lashes, her cheeks flushed from the cold. The umbrella trembled slightly in her grip. She looked at him as if he were a ghost. "What are you doing here, Alex?" Her voice was calm, but underneath, he could hear the years of hurt she carried. He struggled for words, the right ones slipping away like water through his fingers. "I didn't know. I didn't know where you went," he said finally, his voice shaking. "I looked for you." Her laugh was quiet, but it cut deeper than any scream. "You looked for me," she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. "After you told me you didn't even believe the children were yours?" She shook her head slowly. "You don't get to say that to me." He took a step closer, rainwater dripping from his chin. "Emma, I was wrong. I was scared. I said things I didn't mean." "Stop," she interrupted, her voice breaking slightly. "You meant every word. You made it very clear what you thought of me that night." She glanced down at the twins, who were peeking curiously from behind her legs, and her tone softened. "And I will never let them hear those words. Ever." The guilt hit him like a physical blow. He looked at the boys, really looked, and his heart broke all over again. One of them, the bolder of the two, met his gaze and smiled. The smallest, purest smile, and something inside Alexander shattered completely. He crouched down slowly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Hi there," he said, unsure what else to say. The boy tilted his head, still smiling. "Mommy, who's that man?" he asked innocently. Emma's eyes flickered, and for a brief second, he thought she might cry. But instead, she straightened her back, her expression composed once more. "Just someone I used to know," she said softly, and her words cut deeper than any accusation ever could. Alexander stood, his throat tight. The rain continued to pour, the world cold and gray around them, but he felt none of it. He wanted to say something, anything, to make her stay. But she turned away, leading the boys down the street, their small boots splashing through puddles. He watched them go until they disappeared around the corner, the bright yellow of the boys' raincoats fading into the mist. He stood there for a long time, the rain soaking through his clothes, the noise of the city resuming around him. For 2 years, he had believed that nothing could truly reach him again. Now, in a single moment, he realized that his heart was still alive, and that he had lost something far greater than he had ever understood. He had seen his sons for the first time. He had seen the woman he loved walk away again. And this time, he knew he couldn't let it end like that. That night, as thunder rolled above the city and rain lashed against the windows of his empty apartment, Alexander made a promise to himself. He would find her again. He would see them again. And he would do whatever it took to earn back the life he had thrown away. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. The image of Emma standing in the rain with those 2 boys replayed in his mind like a film he couldn't stop. Every detail was burned into him, the way her hair clung to her face, the sound of her voice when she told him to stop, the look in her eyes when their child had asked who he was. He sat in the dark corner of his living room with a drink in his hand, the city lights bleeding through the glass walls of his penthouse. The rain hadn't stopped outside, and its rhythmic tapping against the windows seemed to echo the hollow beating of his heart. The whiskey didn't help. Nothing did. For years, he had built walls of denial around what he'd done, convincing himself that Emma had moved on, that the children, he realized now, were better off without him. But that illusion had shattered the moment he saw their faces. He couldn't unsee the resemblance, couldn't ignore the way his heart recognized them before his mind did. He tried to think logically, like he always did, to analyze the situation and control it, but there was no logic that could make sense of his choices. He had destroyed something pure because he had been afraid. He had doubted her, doubted the one person who had loved him without condition, and in doing so, he had sentenced himself to years of emptiness. He thought about the night she had told him she was pregnant, how she had stood before him trembling yet brave, her voice steady even when he had accused her of betrayal. He had called it caution, had told himself he was protecting his life from chaos. But the truth was simpler and uglier, he had been a coward. He had loved her deeply but was too afraid of what that love demanded of him. Now, after 2 years of pretending, the reality was unavoidable. He had 2 sons. His sons. And they were out there, growing up without him. That thought alone was unbearable. He rose from his chair, pacing the length of the room. His reflection followed him in the dark glass of the window, a man who looked powerful and composed, but whose eyes betrayed him. He didn't look like the confident CEO the world saw, he looked lost. The suit, the empire, the money, all of it felt meaningless. What good was success if the cost had been everything that mattered? He found himself remembering little things about Emma that he had forced himself to forget. The way she would tuck her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the way she always smelled faintly of vanilla and rain, the quiet way she'd hum when she was working. He remembered how she had once told him that love wasn't about control, that it was about trust. He had laughed then, teasing her for being naive. Now, that laugh haunted him. He would have given anything to go back and hold her instead of pushing her away. He couldn't stay still. By dawn, he was out of the apartment, driving through the city with no clear direction. The streets were wet, glistening in the weak morning light. He stopped at the same cafe near where he had seen her the day before, half hoping she might appear again, even though he knew it was unlikely. The memory of her walking away felt like a fresh wound, and yet it was the only thing that made him feel alive. He sat at a corner table, his coffee growing cold, his thoughts restless. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about strategy or image or control. He was thinking about how to make things right, though he had no idea how. When he finally returned to his office, his assistant was waiting with a stack of papers and a list of meetings. Alexander ignored them. He walked straight past her, locking himself in his office. He couldn't focus on contracts or reports. His mind kept returning to the sight of the twins' small hands holding Emma's, the way they had looked at her with complete trust. That kind of love was something he had never known as a child and had been too afraid to give as a man. The thought that his own sons might never know him, might grow up thinking of him as nothing more than a stranger in the rain, tore something open inside him. By midday, he called his private investigator. The man had worked for him for years, used to tracking down business rivals, not lost love. "I need you to find someone," Alexander said quietly. "Her name is Emma Walker." There was a pause on the other end of the line, surprise perhaps, but the man didn't question it. Within hours, he had an address. It was in a quieter part of the city, far from the skyscrapers and luxury apartments Alexander was used to. He hesitated before going. He wasn't sure if he had the right to show up at her door, not after what he had done. But the thought of not trying was worse. The drive felt endless. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he rehearsed what he might say, but every version sounded wrong. Apologies weren't enough. There were no words that could erase years of absence. He parked outside a modest brick building, watching through the windshield as people passed by, umbrellas bobbing in the drizzle. His heart pounded so hard it felt like pain. He almost turned back, but then he saw movement in one of the windows, a flicker of blonde hair, a small child's laugh, and he knew he couldn't leave. He got out of the car, his pulse racing, but halfway to the door, he stopped. Through the glass, he saw them. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her hair pulled back, wearing a soft sweater that made her look even more beautiful than he remembered. The twins were there too, one on her lap, the other scribbling on a piece of paper with a crayon. The sight of them together hit him harder than anything else had. It wasn't just guilt now, it was awe. They were happy. Peaceful. Whole. And he realized that maybe, just maybe, his presence could ruin that. He had always been the storm in her life. What if showing up again only brought her more pain? He stood there for a long time, the rain soaking through his clothes again, his heart warring with itself. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. Every instinct told him to go inside, to beg for forgiveness, to try to be part of their lives. But another voice whispered that she didn't need him anymore, that he had already done enough damage. He turned back toward his car, his chest heavy with conflict, when he heard the door open. "Alex?" Her voice was soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. He froze. Slowly, he turned around. Emma was standing there, holding the door slightly open, her expression unreadable. The twins were behind her, peeking out curiously. He didn't move. Neither did she. The air between them was charged with everything they hadn't said. "I didn't mean to come here," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "We're fine," she said simply. There was no anger in her tone, but no warmth either. It was as if she had built walls around herself too, the same way he once had. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "I know I don't deserve to be here," he said. "But I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." Her eyes softened slightly, but only for a moment. "Sorry doesn't change what happened," she replied quietly. "It doesn't give them back the father they never had." He didn't argue. There was nothing to say. She started to close the door, but then one of the boys slipped past her and ran toward him. Alexander instinctively knelt down, his hands trembling as the child stopped in front of him, looking up with those familiar brown eyes. "Hi," the boy said shyly. "I'm Liam." The sound of that tiny voice broke him. He swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "Hi, Liam," he said softly. "It's nice to meet you." Emma stood in the doorway, her eyes glistening, torn between pulling her son back and letting him stay. In that moment, Alexander didn't reach out, didn't try to take or claim. He simply looked at the little boy, memorizing his face, and whispered, "You have no idea how much I've missed you." He didn't stay long after that. He turned and walked back to his car, the rain falling harder now, but it didn't matter. For the first time in years, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't erase the past, but he could fight for the future. He would find a way to earn her trust again, to be the father those boys deserved. And no matter how long it took, he wouldn't give up this time. Not on them. Not on her. Not again. Alexander didn't return to her doorstep for several days after that night. He wanted to, every instinct inside him screamed to, but something told him that rushing in would only push her further away. He had done enough damage with his impatience in the past, now he needed to learn what patience really meant. For years, his world had been built on force. He took what he wanted, when he wanted, because he could. But Emma was not a contract to be negotiated, and the bond he had broken could not be rebuilt through persistence alone. It would take humility, something he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Every night he lay awake thinking about her and the boys, replaying the sight of them in that small, warm kitchen, the way light had glowed against her hair as she laughed softly at something one of them had said. That sound had stayed in his head, an anchor that kept him from slipping back into the cold emptiness he had known before. He started small. The next time he appeared near their building, it wasn't to knock on her door. He simply waited nearby, telling himself he just wanted to make sure they were safe. It was a lie, of course. He was drawn there by something deeper than concern. The first time he saw them again, Emma was walking the boys to the park. They were bundled in coats, laughing as they jumped over puddles, their tiny hands clutching hers. He stayed at a distance, just far enough not to be noticed. Watching them, he realized that she had built a good life without him, a peaceful, grounded one. The boys were happy, curious, loved. That realization hurt and comforted him at the same time. He wanted to be part of that world, but he also knew he had no right to demand it. For days he kept his distance. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. One afternoon, as he stood by his car across the street, one of the boys, Liam, spotted a stray cat near the curb and ran toward it, slipping free from Emma's hand. A car turned the corner faster than it should have, its tires hissing over the wet pavement. Without thinking, Alexander ran forward, grabbing the boy and pulling him back just as the car sped past. The entire moment lasted only seconds, but it felt like forever. Emma's scream echoed through the street, and when she reached them, she dropped to her knees, holding Liam tightly, her hands trembling. Alexander stood back, breathless, the adrenaline still surging through his veins. When she looked up at him, their eyes met, and for the first time since that night in his office years ago, her gaze wasn't filled with anger, it was filled with confusion. Gratitude. Fear. You saved him, she whispered, her voice shaking. He shook his head. No, I was just there, he said quietly, though they both knew it wasn't true. She looked away, hugging her son again as if afraid he might disappear. The other boy, Noah, stood nearby, watching Alexander curiously. Are you the man from the rain? He asked innocently. Alexander almost smiled. Yeah, he said softly. I guess I am. From that day on, things began to shift in small, almost invisible ways. Emma didn't tell him to stay away when she saw him after that. She didn't invite him in either, but her silence was less sharp, her eyes less cold. Sometimes, when he happened to cross their path, she would nod instead of turning away. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. The twins seemed to accept him faster than she did. Children don't hold grudges, they only sense presence, warmth, sincerity. And Alexander, for all his flaws, was sincere now in a way he had never been before. He started bringing small things, not gifts meant to buy affection, but gestures that spoke of care. He brought a new soccer ball after seeing the boys kicking a deflated one in the park. He repaired the broken latch on the gate of the small playground behind their building one morning before they arrived. When he noticed Emma struggling with groceries one afternoon, he offered to help carry them. She refused at first, but when the paper bag tore and apples spilled across the sidewalk, she sighed and let him assist her. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. As they walked to her apartment that day, silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. You don't have to keep doing this, she finally said. Doing what? He asked, glancing at her. Trying to prove something, she replied. Her tone wasn't cruel, if anything, it was weary. You don't owe me anything anymore, Alex. He stopped walking, the words hitting harder than she probably intended. I owe you everything, he said quietly. And I owe them even more. Inside, the twins had already run ahead, laughing as they kicked off their shoes. Emma lingered near the door, clearly unsure whether to ask him to stay or tell him to leave. He turned to go, sensing her discomfort, but Noah ran back, tugging at his sleeve. Can you read us a story? The boy asked, holding up a picture book. Alexander froze. He glanced at Emma, who stood there hesitating, her lips parted slightly. After a moment, she nodded, just once. He sat down on the small couch in the living room, the boys curling up beside him, their warm weight pressing against his arms. His voice was a little unsteady at first, but as he read, it grew stronger, steadier. Emma stood by the kitchen counter, pretending to tidy up, but she was listening. She couldn't help it. The sound of his voice carried through the small space, rich and deep, and for the first time in years, the apartment felt full, not just of sound, but of something alive. When the story ended, both boys were already dozing, their heads resting on his shoulders. He didn't move, afraid to break the moment. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. They like you, she said. He looked up, meeting her gaze. I like them too, he replied. They're incredible. She folded her arms, her expression unreadable. They're mine, she said quietly, not as a threat but as a reminder. I know, he said. But they're part of me too. He left soon after, careful not to wake the boys. Outside, the night air was cool, the city quieter than usual. For the first time in years, he felt something that almost resembled peace. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not from her, not from himself, but it was a step toward it. He began visiting more often, always respecting her boundaries, always asking before showing up. Slowly, she began to let him. The boys came to expect him, running to the door when they heard his knock. He would spend hours building towers from blocks with them, reading stories, answering their endless questions about the world. Sometimes, when Emma watched him with them, she would catch herself smiling without realizing it, and then quickly look away. But the past still lingered between them like a shadow. Every time he caught her gaze, he could see the hesitation, the unspoken fear that he might leave again. And he understood it. He had left once when she needed him most, and no amount of effort could erase that completely. Still, he was determined. Each small moment mattered, a laugh, a shared meal, a quiet evening that ended without anger. He was learning to build something he couldn't buy, trust. Late one night, after he had tucked the boys into bed and was about to leave, Emma walked him to the door. The air between them was filled with things unsaid. "You've changed," she said finally, her voice low. He turned toward her, unsure if it was a compliment or an accusation. "I had to," he said. "I lost everything that mattered when you walked out of my office that night. I don't want to be that man again." She looked down, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "You hurt me more than anyone ever has," she whispered. "And yet, part of me wants to believe you." He stepped closer but didn't touch her. "Then let me prove it," he said quietly. "Not with words. Just time." For a moment, she didn't move, didn't speak. Then she nodded once, her eyes glistening. "Time," she echoed. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was hope. And that night, as he walked away beneath the soft glow of the streetlights, Alexander realized that hope was enough to keep him moving forward. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man haunted by the past. He felt like someone trying to earn the right to a future. And for him, that was everything. Autumn settled over the city like a quiet sigh, turning the trees into rivers of gold and crimson. It had been months since Alexander had first seen Emma and the boys again, and in that time, the sharp edges between them had begun to dull. Things were not fixed, not yet, but there was a fragile peace forming between them, the kind that had to be handled with care or it would shatter. Alexander visited often now, never without permission. He learned to respect the rhythm of their lives, to enter their world as a guest, not as someone entitled to it. And somehow, that restraint made his presence mean more. The twins had accepted him fully, without hesitation. Every time he appeared, they ran to him with bright smiles, their small arms wrapping around his legs. Their trust was pure, undeserved, and it humbled him in a way nothing else ever had. Emma, however, remained cautious. She no longer looked at him with anger, but there was a quiet distance in her eyes that spoke of caution, of wounds not yet healed. He didn't blame her. He knew that for years she had raised those boys alone, carried their fears, their laughter, their nights of sickness and days of joy without anyone beside her. The thought filled him with a deep, aching guilt, but also admiration. She had done it all, and she had done it well. One crisp Saturday morning, Alexander took the boys to the park while Emma stayed behind to catch up on some work. It was the first time she had trusted him to be alone with them, and he treated that trust as if it were sacred. He held their small hands as they crossed streets, listened to their endless chatter about bugs and superheroes, and watched them run through the fallen leaves, their laughter ringing through the air. For the first time in a very long time, he felt something he hadn't even realized he missed: joy. Simple, uncalculated, unearned joy. The kind that comes not from success, but from belonging. He pushed them on the swings, pretending to complain about how heavy they were, making them laugh until they were breathless. When they asked for ice cream even though the air was cold enough to see their breath, he said yes, because he couldn't bring himself to say no to those bright, expectant eyes. Sitting on the park bench between them, watching them eat while getting more ice cream on their gloves than in their mouths, he felt something stir deep inside him, a sense of being home. He realized, with quiet certainty, that this was what life was supposed to feel like. Not endless meetings or grand success, not the applause of strangers, but this: muddy shoes, sticky fingers, laughter. He had missed all of it, and he would never forgive himself for that. When they returned, Emma met them at the door, her hair tied back, a pencil still tucked behind her ear. The boys ran to her, shouting over each other as they told her about their adventure. She smiled, that soft, real smile that made his chest tighten, and thanked him quietly. Later, as he helped her clean up the kitchen while the twins played in the living room, she spoke without looking at him. "They're happy when you're around," she said, her voice calm but thoughtful. He paused, unsure what to say, then nodded. "They make me happy too." She placed a plate in the cabinet and turned to face him. "I don't want them to get used to something that might disappear," she said softly. "They've lost enough without knowing it." Her words struck him like a knife, but he understood. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for a lie, but found none. "I hope you mean that," she said finally, and turned away. Weeks passed, and slowly, something began to shift. The tension between them was no longer made of anger, it was something gentler now, something that came from uncertainty and unspoken longing. They began to talk more, not about the past but about the small, ordinary things that filled their days. He asked about her work, and she told him about the small design studio she had started. He listened, genuinely, admiring how she had rebuilt her life from nothing. In turn, she asked about his company, and for the first time, he admitted how hollow success had begun to feel. "It doesn't mean anything without someone to share it with," he said one evening, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the twins sleeping on the couch. There were moments, fleeting but real, when the distance between them seemed to fade completely. One night, when the boys had fallen asleep watching a movie, she brought him a blanket and a cup of tea. He took it, their fingers brushing lightly, and for an instant, the world seemed to still. Neither of them spoke, but in that silence, there was understanding. There was something fragile growing there again, something neither of them dared name. Then, as life tends to do, the peace was tested. One evening, as Alexander arrived, he found Emma sitting at the table, a letter in her hands. Her face was pale, her expression guarded. "You've been offered a position in London," she said, her voice steady. "Your assistant called while you were on your way here." He froze. He hadn't checked his messages. The offer had been in discussion for months, a merger, a chance to lead a new global branch. It was the kind of opportunity men in his position dreamed of. But now, looking at her, at the boys playing with toy cars on the floor, the thought of leaving made him feel sick. "I'm not going," he said without hesitation. Emma frowned, disbelief flickering across her face. "You can't just turn down something like that," she said. "You've worked your whole life for it." He shook his head. "I worked my whole life for something I thought I wanted," he said quietly. "And I lost what really mattered. I'm not making that mistake again." She stared at him, her eyes searching his, torn between admiration and fear. "Don't do this because of guilt," she said after a long pause. "Don't stay because you feel like you owe us something." He stepped closer, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm staying because this is where I belong." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. She didn't answer right away, didn't tell him what he wanted to hear. But something in her expression softened, a small flicker of trust returning to her eyes. He didn't push for more. He just stayed, helping her put the boys to bed, listening to their sleepy chatter, tucking the blankets under their chins. When he turned off the light, he lingered for a moment, watching them sleep. For the first time in his life, he felt like a man who finally understood what it meant to have everything he needed. Later, as he stood by the window while Emma locked up for the night, she spoke quietly from behind him. "You really changed," she said. He turned to her, his expression open, his voice steady. "You're the reason I had to." She looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "I don't know if I can ever forget what you said back then," she whispered. "But I see how you look at them. How you are with them. I can't deny that it means something." He took a step forward, closing the distance between them until he could see the reflection of the city lights in her eyes. "It means everything," he said softly. She didn't move away, didn't speak. The space between them felt fragile but alive, like a heartbeat. And though she eventually turned away, he knew something had changed. The wall between them was beginning to crack, and through those cracks, light was starting to find its way in. That night, as he walked home through the quiet streets, Alexander realized that he no longer felt like a visitor in their lives. He wasn't just trying to make amends anymore. He was building something new, something stronger, built not on pride or power, but on love, patience, and time. For the first time in years, he wasn't haunted by what he had lost. He was driven by what he could still become. Winter arrived quietly that year, settling over the city with a kind of stillness that seemed to seep into everything. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the first snow fell like a whisper, blanketing the streets in white. For most people, it was the season of warmth and family, of comfort behind closed doors. For Alexander, it was something more profound, a season of redemption, fragile and precious. His life had begun to take on a rhythm he hadn't known he was capable of, a rhythm built not around meetings or deadlines but around the soft laughter of two small boys and the quiet presence of the woman he had once destroyed. He visited nearly every evening now, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes books, sometimes nothing but himself. Emma had stopped questioning his presence. There were no more hesitant glances toward the door when he arrived, no tightness in her shoulders when he sat down. She had grown used to him being there, to the sound of his deep voice reading bedtime stories, to the way he quietly cleaned up after dinner without being asked. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was peace. He found himself craving that peace more than he ever craved success. The twins adored him. They had reached the age where their curiosity seemed endless, their questions spilling out in rapid succession. Why is the sky blue? Why does snow melt? Why do people fall in love? That last one had made Emma laugh softly, hiding her smile behind her hand, while Alexander struggled for an answer that made sense. The boys didn't need an explanation, they only needed his laughter in return. And every time he looked at them, he felt something deep inside him shift. These children, his children, had his eyes, his hair, and yet they were so much more than him. They were everything he wanted to be, innocent, open, unafraid of the world. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when Emma's guard would suddenly return, when she would look at him as if remembering every wound he had caused. Sometimes he would reach for a plate and their hands would brush, and he would feel her flinch, just slightly. Those moments hurt, but he never pulled away first. He simply stayed, steady and patient, showing her through silence that he wasn't going anywhere. It was in those quiet moments that he began to understand what love truly meant. It wasn't passion or grand gestures, it was consistency. It was choosing someone again and again, even when they couldn't yet choose you back. One night, in the heart of December, the boys came down with the flu. The apartment was filled with the sound of coughing, restless whimpers, and the steady hum of a humidifier in the corner. Emma hadn't slept in 2 days, her hair pulled back in a loose knot, dark circles under her eyes. When Alexander arrived, she didn't even try to tell him to leave. She just looked at him, exhausted, and said, "They won't stop crying." Without a word, he took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and went to work. He made tea for her, found the thermometer, and sat beside the boy's bed, his large hand resting gently on one small forehead, then the other. Hours passed like that, in a kind of quiet partnership. When one of the boys began to stir, Alexander hummed softly under his breath, an old melody he hadn't thought about in years, one his mother used to sing to him when he was a child. Emma stood in the doorway, watching him. The soft light from the lamp touched his face, highlighting the lines that hadn't been there before, the tiredness in his eyes that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with love. Something inside her cracked open. For the first time, she didn't see the man who had abandoned her. She saw a father, gentle, devoted, utterly human. When dawn broke, the boys were finally sleeping peacefully. Emma sat on the couch, too tired to move. Alexander brought her a blanket and sat beside her. The silence between them was thick but calm, filled not with tension but with understanding. "You should get some rest," he said softly. She shook her head. "I can't. What if they wake up?" He smiled faintly. "Then we'll both be here." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for a moment, the past didn't exist. "You never used to be like this," she whispered. "You were always so unreachable." His gaze softened. "I didn't know how to be anything else," he said. "I thought being strong meant being alone. But I was wrong. Strength isn't shutting people out, it's staying, even when it hurts." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. "You hurt me so much," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I can be better." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The snow fell silently outside the window, the city glowing faintly under its white cover. Emma finally leaned back against the couch, closing her eyes. "You don't have to prove anything tonight," she murmured. "Just stay." He didn't say a word. He simply reached out, took her hand gently, and held it. They sat like that until morning light filled the room. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. Over the next few weeks, the small cracks in the wall between them began to heal. They started sharing dinners, not out of obligation but out of comfort. The boys began insisting that he stay for bedtime stories every night. Sometimes, after the twins fell asleep, Emma would make coffee, and they would talk quietly in the kitchen, about everything and nothing, the books she was reading, the places he had traveled, the lives they might have lived if things had gone differently. There were nights when laughter came easily, and others when it didn't. One evening, she found an old photograph of them in a drawer, taken years ago at a company retreat. They were standing close, both smiling, caught in a moment before everything had fallen apart. She stared at it for a long time before showing it to him. "Do you remember this?" she asked. He took the photo, his thumb brushing against her hand as he looked at it. "Every day," he said quietly. "I've never forgotten any of it." That night, as he was leaving, she walked him to the door. The snow was still falling, heavy and soft. He turned to say good night, but before he could, she reached up and brushed a snowflake from his hair. The gesture was so simple, so tender, that he froze. Their eyes met, and for the first time since their reunion, she didn't look away. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition, forgiveness, a small, trembling beginning of love reborn. When the door closed behind him, Alexander stood on the steps for a long time, watching the snow fall, his breath misting in the cold air. He didn't need promises or declarations. He had seen it in her eyes, the quiet truth that she was no longer holding on to hate. The past was still there, but so was the future, fragile and waiting. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man haunted by his mistakes. He felt like someone who might, just might, deserve to be forgiven. That night, as he walked home through the snow-covered streets, he realized something simple but profound. Love wasn't about what he had lost, or even what he hoped to gain. It was about showing up, every day, through the fear, through the doubt, through the cold. And for Emma, for the boys, he would keep showing up, for as long as it took. The new year came quietly, without fireworks or celebration. For Emma and Alexander, it arrived in small, ordinary moments, the sound of the boys' laughter echoing down the hallway, the warmth of the apartment filled with the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings, the peace of knowing that some wounds, though deep, were finally beginning to heal. Life had settled into a rhythm that neither of them had dared to imagine 2 years ago. Alexander was still cautious, careful not to push too far or too fast, but his presence had become something constant, something the boys relied on, and slowly, Emma began to rely on it too. She would never admit it aloud, but there were days when she caught herself waiting for the familiar knock on the door, when she found herself listening for his voice, for the steady calm it brought into her world. Alexander had changed in ways that even surprised himself. His work no longer consumed him the way it used to. He still ran his company, still made decisions that shaped futures, but his priorities had shifted entirely. He no longer measured his worth by profit margins or the headlines his name appeared in. His success was quieter now, the kind that came from watching his sons' faces light up when they saw him, from making Emma smile when she thought he wasn't looking, from the feeling of belonging that filled him every time he sat at their kitchen table. There were moments when he thought about the man he had been before, the one who believed he could live without love, and the thought filled him with both shame and gratitude. Shame for how blind he had been, gratitude for the chance to be someone better. One morning, as he arrived at their apartment, he found Emma in the middle of a small domestic disaster. The twins had managed to spill orange juice all over the kitchen floor while trying to pour it themselves, and she was kneeling on the tiles, mopping up the mess with a towel, her hair falling loose around her face. The sight of her, frazzled, laughing softly at the chaos, hit him harder than he expected. She looked so alive, so real, so achingly beautiful. Without thinking, he bent down beside her to help. "You don't have to," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. "I want to," he replied simply. For a moment, their eyes met, and something warm passed between them, something deeper than words. As the days turned into weeks, their connection began to grow in ways that neither of them could quite control. It was in the little things, the way he stayed late after putting the boys to bed, the way she didn't immediately insist he leave, the way their conversation stretched longer into the night. Sometimes, they talked about the past, not the painful parts, but the moments before it all fell apart. She reminded him of their first late-night dinner years ago, the one where he'd confessed that he didn't believe in fate. He remembered it vividly, remembered how she had laughed and told him that maybe fate didn't believe in him either. Now, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table, he realized that fate had simply been waiting for him to grow up. One evening in early spring, they took the twins to the park again. The snow had melted, leaving behind patches of damp earth and the faint smell of renewal. The boys ran ahead, their laughter echoing through the trees, while Alexander and Emma walked slowly behind them. The sun was setting, casting the world in gold and rose, and for the first time, it didn't feel like they were two people trying to repair something broken. It felt like they were building something new. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if things had gone differently?" she asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He thought for a moment before answering. "Every day," he said. "But if they had, I wouldn't have learned what love really is. I wouldn't have learned what you mean to me." She didn't respond right away, but her expression softened, her gaze flickering toward him for just a moment before returning to the boys. Later that night, when the twins had fallen asleep, she found him in the living room, sitting on the couch, lost in thought. "You should go home," she said gently. He looked up at her, his eyes tired but kind. "I don't want to," he said quietly. "This feels like home." The simplicity of the words made her heart ache. She turned away, afraid of what he might see in her eyes. "You make it sound easy," she murmured. "It's not," he replied. "But nothing worth having ever is." There was a pause, long and fragile, filled with the sound of the rain starting to fall outside. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "You can stay. Just for tonight." He didn't question it. He didn't move closer or try to take more than what she offered. He just stayed. They sat together on the couch, the sound of the rain surrounding them, the soft breathing of their sons in the next room like a promise. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he closed his eyes, afraid that if he spoke, the moment would disappear. It was the first time in years that they had allowed themselves to simply exist together without the ghosts of the past between them. From that night on, the air between them felt different. There was something unspoken but undeniable, something fragile and real. Alexander found himself smiling more easily, laughing more often. Emma, too, seemed lighter, her eyes brighter, her walls no longer impenetrable. There were still moments of hesitation, times when fear crept back into her voice or when she'd pull away after realizing how close they'd become, but those moments no longer defined them. What defined them now were the mornings when he brought coffee and helped pack the boys' lunches, the evenings when they all sat together playing board games, the quiet smiles that passed between them when no one else was looking. One night, after a particularly long day, Emma confessed something she hadn't told anyone before. "When I found out I was pregnant," she said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, "I thought I'd never stop hating you. Every time I felt them kick, every time I was scared or alone, I told myself I'd never forgive you. But then they were born, and I looked at them, and all I could think was how much they looked like you. I hated that too, at first. But then, it made me feel less alone." Her voice trembled slightly. "It's strange, isn't it? How love survives even when you try to kill it." He didn't know what to say. He just reached across the table, his hand covering hers. She didn't pull away this time. "I don't deserve what you've given me," he said quietly. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, he saw not pain in her eyes, but something gentler, acceptance. Weeks later, the company he had built announced a new expansion. Reporters wanted interviews, investors demanded meetings, but Alexander refused to let it consume him. He made it clear to his board that family came first. Some of them didn't understand, others thought he was losing his edge. He didn't care. He had learned that power meant nothing if you couldn't use it to protect the people you loved. That spring, when the city bloomed again, Alexander took Emma and the twins on their first trip together, to the countryside, away from the noise and pressure of everything that had once defined him. They stayed in a small cottage surrounded by wildflowers, where the boys could run free and the air smelled like new beginnings. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the boys chased fireflies in the garden, he turned to Emma and said quietly, "This is what I dreamed about without even realizing it." She smiled, her eyes glinting with the light of the setting sun. "And to think," she said softly, "it all started with a mistake." He shook his head. "No. It started with fear. But it's ending with love." She didn't argue. She didn't need to. The way she looked at him said enough. And when the boys came running toward them, their laughter filling the air, Emma reached for his hand without hesitation. It was warm, solid, real. In that moment, Alexander knew that whatever came next, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The summer that followed was the warmest anyone could remember. The city shimmered under golden light, and every day seemed to carry a sense of renewal, as if the world itself had decided to give Alexander and Emma another chance. By then, their lives had settled into a kind of beautiful imperfection. The boys were growing fast, curious, clever, mischievous, and their laughter filled every corner of Emma's apartment, every silence that had once felt unbearable. Alexander had all but moved in, though neither of them had spoken the words aloud. His toothbrush sat beside hers, his books were stacked on the coffee table, and his jacket hung by the door, as naturally as if it had always belonged there. He wasn't an outsider anymore. He was home. Still, not everything was effortless. There were days when the past would resurface, uninvited and sharp. Sometimes Emma would fall quiet when he mentioned the years they had spent apart, or when she saw a photograph of him in a magazine, smiling beside other executives in suits and ties, the life he had once chosen over her. There were still nights when fear crept in, the fear that this peace was fragile, that it could be taken away at any moment. Alexander understood that fear all too well. He lived with his own guilt every day, a quiet reminder of what he had done. But now, instead of running from it, he let it keep him grounded. It reminded him to stay humble, to stay present, to never take a single moment for granted. One morning, they took the twins to the lake outside the city. The air was warm and sweet, the sky wide and endless. The boys ran ahead, their laughter echoing across the water, while Emma spread a blanket under a tree. Alexander carried the basket, watching her with a kind of quiet awe. There were still moments when he couldn't believe this was real, that the woman he had once lost had chosen to let him back into her life. As they sat together, watching their sons chase each other along the shore, Emma turned to him with a faint smile. "You look like a man who's thinking too much," she said. He laughed softly. "I'm just thinking that I don't deserve this." She shook her head. "You're wrong," she said simply. "You fought for it. You changed. You earned it." The words sank into him like sunlight, warm and healing. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back on his elbows, watching the boys, listening to their laughter, and feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. Later, when the afternoon heat softened and the sky turned gold, Emma pulled out a small camera and began taking pictures. She captured the twins holding hands, their curls shining in the light, and then turned the lens toward Alexander. He groaned, half laughing. "Don't. I look ridiculous." She smiled, snapping the photo anyway. "You look like a father," she said softly. That word, simple and whole, hit him with a force he hadn't expected. He smiled then, a real one, and reached out to pull her close. As the sun began to set, painting the world in amber and rose, they sat together in silence, the boys asleep on the blanket beside them. Emma leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The air smelled of pine and water, the sound of crickets rising in the distance. "I used to think our story ended the night you said those words to me," she said quietly. "That there was nothing left to save." He swallowed, his hand tightening around hers. "So did I," he admitted. "But maybe that night wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning of who we had to become." She turned to look at him, her eyes soft and shining in the fading light. "Do you really believe that?" He nodded. "I do now." When they returned to the city, life continued in its steady rhythm. There were school forms to fill out, meetings to attend, nights of exhaustion and mornings of chaos. But there was also laughter, small kindnesses, and an ease that had never existed before. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Alexander found Emma sitting on the balcony, the city lights reflected in her eyes. She looked peaceful in a way he had never seen before. "You know," she said after a moment, "I spent so long trying to hate you. It was easier than missing you." He walked over, standing behind her, resting his hands gently on her shoulders. "I never stopped missing you," he said quietly. "Even when I tried to convince myself I had." She reached up, her fingers brushing against his hand. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't said that? If you had believed me from the start?" He hesitated, his voice low. "If I hadn't made that mistake, I wouldn't have lost you. But if I hadn't lost you, I wouldn't have learned how to love you right." She turned then, looking up at him, and for the first time since they had met again, the distance between them was completely gone. He leaned down slowly, giving her the space to pull away if she wanted to, but she didn't. When their lips met, it wasn't like the first time, desperate and uncertain. It was quiet, steady, full of everything they had survived. The weeks that followed seemed to pass in a blur of simple joy. The boys started preschool, bringing home paintings and stories every day. Alexander began working fewer hours, finding ways to balance the life he had built with the one he had found. He still ran his company, but he no longer let it define him. He came home earlier, helped with dinner, tucked the boys into bed, and fell asleep beside Emma with the sound of their soft breathing in the next room. It was an ordinary happiness, but to him, it felt extraordinary. One night, as they sat together watching the rain fall outside, Emma spoke quietly. "You know what's strange," she said. "Sometimes I look at you and think about the man who told me I'd ruin his life. And then I look at you now, and I see someone who's built his whole life around us. It's hard to believe you're the same person." He smiled faintly. "I'm not," he said. "You changed me." She shook her head. "No. You changed yourself. I just gave you a reason." There was a long pause, the kind that wasn't empty but full of everything unsaid. Then, softly, she added, "I forgive you." He looked at her, his breath catching for a moment. "You do?" She nodded. "Not because I forgot what you did. But because I see who you've become." He reached for her hand, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll never stop trying to be worthy of that." She smiled then, the same soft, radiant smile that had once undone him completely. "You already are." Years later, Alexander would think back to that moment whenever life grew difficult. He would remember the rain tapping against the window, the warmth of her hand in his, the peace of finally being seen not as who he was, but as who he had become. The man who had once shouted in fear and pride had learned that love wasn't a weakness. It was the only thing strong enough to rebuild what had been broken. And so, as the rain continued to fall outside, he drew her close, his hand resting over hers. In that quiet room, with their son sleeping safely down the hall, Alexander Reed finally understood that the life he had once feared, the one built on love, forgiveness, and family, was the only one worth living. He had lost everything once, but now he had everything that truly mattered. And this time, he would never let it go.